Hello and welcome to the third video on the Breathe and Be Free classroom here on our Skool community. I have definitely been innovating what's been going on with these videos, and mostly this is just because I have had a lot of challenges in recording the videos. I had some issues with my laptop, and now we are here. Now we are able to do the video, which is great. I just decided to, go live on YouTube and it will save it for me. So that's awesome. And I hope you guys are very well today. We're going to be talking today about some of the physiological experiences that we may feel when we change the breath within our bodies. This might be chemistry changes, this might be emotional changes, this might actually be how we feel within our body, and this can be really tied to things like oxygen, CO2 levels, and our sensory experience connected to our five senses. So there's a lot of pieces here that really can change and shift as we go through our breath journey. And one thing to recognize as well is that a lot of the work that I do within breathwork is working with what's called a conscious connected breath pattern. And so, what we're doing here is, we're working with the breath and we're breathing in and out through an open jaw, or we're breathing in through the nose and out through that mouth. So this conscious connected flow of the breath can actually create a lot of changes in the body. And because we're in a circular pattern with the breath, it's really interesting that our body starts to regulate. It starts to down-regulate if the nervous system is already quite heightened. And there's a number of things that will happen as we start to change the breath. And, if we're not breathing just as we are now, then we will be essentially changing things within our body. So just to really reinforce here as well that, as we are exploring the breath and exploring a deeper and fuller breath within any practice, there's also some things to be aware of with this. And so if you are of sound mind and body and you know that you can do breath work, then that's awesome. If you may be unsure about these things, I would definitely recommend talking to a medical professional about if breath work is actually suitable for you, because it's really important to recognize that if you can't maintain any kind of like high intensity workout or exercise, if you can't sustain an elevated blood pressure or heart rate, then it would actually be pretty unlikely that the practice would be suitable for you. And it's very much, it's good to take discretion, but it's also good to know your limits. So really just keep that in mind within your experience of breathwork, whatever it might unfold from here. So getting into some of the just some of the physiology and some of the things that really will shift and change as we go through our experience with the breath. So, first of all, the one thing that I have really noted within a breath experience is that, as we're going through daily life, we're just breathing at a, reasonable pace. We're just breathing in and out, and we're not really aware of our breath. We're really just letting the, automatic system of our breath to essentially do what it needs to do. We're not like thinking, okay, let's take a breath in now, let's take a breath out. Because if we had to think about that and it wasn't an autonomic process, then we would probably stop breathing for sure. So, and then another thing that I wanted to really, talk about within this video today as well is that, there are a number of things that happen within the body, and we'll get into the science and essentially the chemistry of the breath. And then we're going to get into the physiological experiences that are tied to those chemical changes, as well as our emotional and just sort of physical things that might come up. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the video today. So, and then something to really note as well. I know we had talked about mechanics previously, and just to recognize that in our body, we might experience these shifts because we're actually breathing deeply, we're breathing fuller, we're really engaging all parts of our diaphragms in the body. And even if we're taking a breath and we're expanding the rib cage, our intercostal muscles are starting to expand and starting to warm up as we take our first breaths. We will actually be either regulating or heightening certain parts of our nervous system. And as well, there's a big part of this that actually changes as far as the CO2 and oxygen goes. So essentially, we are lowering our CO2 in the body, but we are essentially lowering that CO2, and we are changing the relationship between how much oxygen can actually attach to that CO2 and then move through our system and essentially meet up with our cells and become, what is energy, right? So, yeah, and then really to, talk about this a little bit more, we have that reduction in CO2 levels. This actually raises our pH and it can reduce oxygen delivery. So we will experience some physical changes from that, essentially from that correlation of the CO2 and the oxygen. So it's like, the CO2 is cruising along and, let's say it's cruising on, it's like a bus, right? We got the CO2 bus and all of a sudden the oxygen wants to get on the bus, right? But if the CO2 is only running at like half capacity, then the oxygen can only fit so much before that CO2 would essentially not be able to hold as much oxygen. So think about it like that, it's like if the bus is only going so fast, if the bus only has so many seats, then the oxygen only has such a capacity to move forward with the CO2, to meet up essentially with the cells within the body. There's a huge exchange going on within the lower part of the lungs at this point. So any CO2 that comes in, we're going to have that exchange within the lungs as we inspirate. And as we exhale or expirate, we're going to have an opposition of that. So, we have less CO2 and oxygen, we're going to be breathing, and we're going to, lessen that as well. So as we are breathing in and out, it's important and essential to realize that there will be physical shifts, there will be physical changes that come up through this process. And this is actually quite beneficial because there's another process that happens, which is the relationship between vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So, in essence, it seems kind of funny like, oh, well, we're dilating and we are releasing our blood vessels in our body. Well, yes, like we're doing that. We're doing that with our entire system, right? It's our veins, it's our capillaries, it's our the valves of our heart are actually like shifting and changing through each breath. So, this is really interesting, this relationship between the CO2 and the oxygen and how things will change in the body, and why it is so interesting and so beneficial to know about this when you're learning about the breath is that essentially, if we are going through vasoconstriction, then that means that we're giving the opportunity for the body to eventually vasodilate, and we're bringing fresh blood, we're bringing fresh cells, we're bringing new life to the areas of our body that might need it more than others. So, if we're dealing with inflammation, right, we're going to be flushing through any inflammation that's in certain parts of our system, and we're going to be able to essentially bring those healthy cells. It's also going to be moving information, so we're moving that information through, and the body is getting information about, oh, we've got some, more white blood cells in one area, red blood cells in another area. So that vasodilation and that vasoconstriction, that relationship is really important in the body because it is actually giving the body the ability to know what's happening. It's almost like a real-time, live feed of what's happening in the body. So those are just some results of things that can happen after our breath practice. And this is also really related to things like cryotherapy or cold therapy, really notable changes in the body through research and science around that vasoconstriction and the vasodilation and what happens after that. So yeah, and another thing to really note as well, with the CO2 and the transport, like I was talking about, we have that exchange, and usually if there's more CO2, then more oxygen can essentially jump onto the CO2 bus and be converted from the lungs to the red blood cells and back out again through that reverse process, as I had mentioned. So, and relating back to what I had said about the drop in CO2, having that CO2 level drop, that increase in pH, we're going to essentially have tingling, maybe physical nervous system activations, tightness of muscles, muscle spasms. These are things that can naturally come up through our experience with changing our breath, and how that relationship between the oxygen and the CO2 will really start to do different things in the body. So if you are working with the breath, if you've ever held your breath for a certain amount of time, you'll note that there is a drop in oxygen. And essentially, this can do a number of things to our bodies and to our nervous system as well. So, sometimes this is beneficial because holding our breath and essentially being able to have this exchange in our relation to our CO2 and to our oxygen. um, really the big thing here is we are, like I said, we are shifting how our body responds, how it reacts, and this is directly related to stress. So, our body can actually come into a more regulated state in the nervous system if we practice things like breath holds, any kind of like, cadence breath. So, if we're breathing in for 6, we're holding for 4, and we're breathing out for 6. Like, these regular practices over time can actually calibrate the nervous system and give it the ability to essentially be like, oh, I'm okay. Like, I'm going to survive. I'm going to be just fine. So, just something interesting to note around that. And, also what I was talking about with that open mouth breathing, right? Sometimes actually, and this is particularly noteworthy when we practice a breath method called breath of surrender, is that when we're breathing in and out through our open jaw, when we're not really engaging much within our nasal passages, there is actually a regulation of our parasympathetic nervous system. And really, this is giving our body, again, that information to regulate how the body will take in oxygen and nutrients, how our digestion is functioning, like I said, that exchange of information through the cells, even down to the mitochondrial level. So this is really interesting in terms of, how we can support our bodies on a level that doesn't have to be measured, that doesn't have to be, given a supplement or a treatment. It's like we can just do the breath work and just see what happens. And for myself included, like, I have noted huge changes in my health and wellness, my mental state, my capacity for stress, and enduring certain long, essentially, like, if I'm doing any kind of exercise or longer duration activities, I have more of a ability to sustain those activities, and my endurance seems to be much better than it used to be, which, I mean, we can all agree that's a great outcome. So, yeah. And then as well, really just talking about the nervous system. So, when I was talking about that regulation of the parasympathetic, right? That's usually when we have our mouth open. When we are not holding the breath, we're just sort of like slowly restoring and increasing and decreasing the CO2 levels. So don't forget that within this, and when we hold our breath, and if we are breathing, like, let's say we're breathing into the nose and out, if we do that like 40 or 50 times in a row, we're going to be elevating the CO2 quickly. And what that does mean is that we are essentially changing that physical chemistry. We're changing the physiology and those reactions and different nervous system experiences. And even, like I said, the muscle twitching, some of those tightening of the hands and feet, any of these different, essentially they're symptoms for the body to recognize that we are receiving less CO2. And within that as well, and what I find is really quite interesting with this is that it's a temporary relationship, right? So it's like if we're doing these quicker elevations of CO2, if we are, decreasing CO2 in some way, for example, either way, those changes will really help to have the body understand that, we are temporarily shifting something, and the breath hold itself in a breath pattern will actually give our body information about what might be coming, what might be happening in the body. It has this ability to have a predictive function of like, okay, we are doing this breath hold, and mentally we might go through a few things with that. But physiologically, our body is essentially going to do exactly what it needs to do to ensure that that quick elevation in the CO2 and that quick increase in oxygen will result in a change that essentially won't have, like, it's not as if your body's going to go into that state and essentially stay there, right? So a good example of this is if we're talking about things like hypothermia, right? Like once we get into a more severe hypothermic state, it takes our body a much longer time to get out of that state. Same with things like hypoxia in the case of breath holding. If we are too much in that zone or that window of our own physical tolerance where we are not able to sustain that for a long period of time, our body's going to take a much longer time to come out of that state. But if we're just playing with like 1 or 2 minute holds or something like that, then our body's going to know exactly how to essentially come back to balance. But there will be those physiological changes. And, essentially, if we're not used to having those kind of changes, then, it's important to recognize that there are times when we may be going beyond that point of benefit, and to just be really aware that we have to be quite, in the driver's seat of our own experience with our practice. So. And yeah, so the other thing I was going to really talk about today that I think is so important is that relationship between the those oxygen and CO2 changes and what will happen within the nervous system as well. So this is something that I really love to learn about when I was learning more um, about my nervous system, learning more about the breath. And the big thing here is that essentially when we are talking about the tingling, the lightheadedness, that reduction in oxygen delivery, we may experience an elevation in heart rate. Things like adrenaline may increase, and we're coming into a state of arousal. And within the nervous system, we're going from the parasympathetic to the sympathetic temporarily. We have to keep in mind, again, like I just said, about how we can go outside of that window of tolerance into a state where it doesn't actually give us any benefit at some point. We're into like hyperventilation, we're anxious, we're really like feeling a lot in the body. So we have to be really mindful of when that shift happens, and that, there is this aspect of essentially going between like the dorsal vagal, part of our nervous system and into, a parasympathetic state, right? So we have to be really aware of these things. And what I want to break down for you really quickly is, let's see here, bring up my notes on this as well. So essentially, we're just talking about that complex network that really brings everything together within the sensory information of our body, our brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And so this is all related to like movement, thought, memory, things like involuntary processes. So that's why our heartbeat and digestive system can actually be affected by breath, is that, essentially that we will have shifts and changes within these aspects, like an increase in digestion, an increase in heart rate. It's almost like we're going into like a small state of like almost like a cardio workout or something, right? Like our body starts to interpret that. So yeah, it's really interesting to see that relation and really understand it. And the peripheral nervous system itself, that is essentially like, what would affect our physical sensation. So that tetany, that tightening, those muscular twitches, that's that outer part of our nervous system. It's basically connected to everything, but it's connecting that central column of our nervous system to that outer part of the nervous system, like hands, feet, legs, like all of the parts that aren't like our spinal cord, essentially. And it's transmitting a lot of information, and it's telling, our central nervous system, okay, this is happening, so like we need to do this, or this needs to happen within the center, right? So, again, another good example is if we are going through hypothermia, our central nervous system will actually start to do core processes to almost go on to like standby mode, and our outer peripheral nervous system will actually start to slow down and almost like go to a very slow pace to acclimate to things essentially drawing in through the center of our body. But blood wise, we're actually, when we're going through that state, the blood is actually going into our center to protect our organs from failure. So the nervous system is very complicated, and I'm sure we could get into it another time. But what I really wanted to talk about, there are these different pieces of the nervous system, and I'm going to drop I'll drop a photo as well into this video as well, and just so that we all have it and we can refer back to it. I think it'd be a really great way to, essentially have it on hand. So we're talking a lot about the parasympathetic and sympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system, we're talking about heart, smooth muscle, our glands, anything that's sort of outside of that central nervous system. And then the parasympathetic is sort of like that, okay, I'm okay. I'm able to just reset, relax. I am at ease. Think about like the animal just ran from the hyena, and it's like, I'm good now, right? And the other part is the sympathetic division of the nervous system. So that's our activity, our alert, our like, okay, the hyena is coming. What do we do next, right? It also is related to like if we are in a state of like, facing that challenging, conversation, if we have to go to a work meeting, something like that, right? There's all these different aspects in our life now that actually relate to this. So just wanted to, really just give you a good overview of that. And the one thing about breathwork that is so cool, well, in my opinion, but you guys will probably think it's super cool too, is that, we are temporarily playing with that sympathetic activation, and it brings us into deeper states of rest and digest. So it's like, we go through the big thing, and then we come down, and we're ready, we're reset, we're more capable of taking on the things that we're looking to take on. So yeah, these are just really cool aspects of the nervous system that we can play with that do help us to live a more regulated and balanced life. And the other thing I wanted to really emphasize here before I close out the video is just sort of the aspect of how we breathe, and when we're changing that relationship between our breath and our body, we're actually shifting things within our daily life. So this really is why breath work isn't just something you do during a session. It's not something that we just do like we lay on our mat and this is our session, and then we just go and it's like everything's better now, right? It's like it changes that baseline function, that operating frequency that we show up at on a regular basis. It's how we handle everything in our life, whether it be stress, discomfort, challenging conversations, anything to do with, that work-life balance. So, and I find too that it's like if we're running on autopilot, this is a great way for us to come back into the body. I always think of this as like embodied practice because we're coming back into the body. So, just something fun to play with as we go on is to really consider that, what we're doing here goes beyond the breath. It goes beyond the practice. And also that breath work isn't really about breathing more. It's not about, doing more. It's actually about like taking out the control, taking out that piece of needing to do so much and doing more with less effort. So yeah, keep that in mind. This could be fun, it could be something that really supports you, especially those control freaks out there, because I know you're there. I know I'm here, so I know you're there. And also that, we can really start to create consistency and create this relationship with our breath. And essentially, our body's going to start to understand its own rhythm. We're going to be able to tune into that rhythm. And, it's more about awareness, right? It's like we already are breathing, we're already living, we're already existing. How can we be more present? How can we be more aware of the functions of our body? And, essentially, how can we really start to connect to our nervous system, to connect to our emotional experience, and to really come back into that grounded state of being? So, and the last piece I wanted to talk about really was that emotional component, right? So, naturally within your experience of breath, you will be feeling some kind of emotional change, whether it's more gratitude or more joy. But you might also bring up some of those wounds, some of those darker pieces within yourself. And I just want to invite you to really see where that takes you within our next couple weeks together and in the future, right? I'm going to be offering a lot more content here, and I would really love it if you guys could take a moment in your day to really be present with this. And I know I had posted a post recently about that, just to follow up on, like, are you breathing rhythmically? Are you breathing, in and out at the same rate, at the same cadence? Like, oh, I'm breathing in for about 5, I'm breathing out for about 5. Or are there some kinds of changes and things going on within your breath that are indicating certain things, right? So, just curious about that. Let's stay curious about the breath. Would love to hear your response and see what you've got going on with your breath. And also just to really support you through this journey. Like, that's why I've created this community. That's why we're here together. And I just can't wait for us to all just deepen and explore this together. So thanks for tuning in. I know this was a long one today, but we had a lot to cover. And next week, we're going to be talking all about breath and daily life. So we're going to be talking about how we integrate breath into daily life. We're going to have a live call next week. So I will post about our live call next week. If you can join us, that would be amazing. It'll be later in the week, probably closer to like Friday, Saturday, or maybe Sunday. And what this is going to entail is essentially just giving you some gentle breathing exercises to take with you in everyday life. And if you're stressed out at work, if you've got deadlines, if you've got kids, if you've got to catch the bus and you're like, crap, I'm so stressed out, these are going to be practices that will help you to essentially show up in a better capacity and to really just be in your body. And we're going to talk a little bit about, how does breath really affect us in our regular daily, experiences, right? And we might have some really funny discussion about, that in-law that makes us angry, or that cousin that always seems to like annoy us or shoot us down on our dreams, right? So these are different examples of things where the breath can actually support us. So thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one. Have a wonderful week.